Hello everyone, welcome to Two Car Pros. My name is Ryan and today we're doing part 6 of our How to Build a Big Block series, and today's a really exciting day because we're putting pistons in an engine. So let's go ahead and jump right in. If you need any supplementary material, you can check out our last 5 videos. I put them in a huge playlist here on YouTube, and all applicable links are down below in the description. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and put some pistons in an engine. We have our pistons here. They're nice and fresh from the machine shop that we had hone out our engine and do all that work we've done in the previous episodes. So the first thing we're gonna do is take a piston out, and you can see that the machine shop has already put the connecting rod in here with the wrist pin. And what you want to do is make sure that this is able to, flap around kind of like a bearing, so it's nice and smooth. That this cogwheels at all or is tough to do, it needs to go back to the machine shop because it'll make noises later on in its life and has a possibility to destroy itself. But this is perfect. You can see it's nice and free, moves perfectly nice. They've already installed the wrist pin like I said. This is a forged piston from SRP. I've left a link down below in the description to this piston if you want to follow along with us. You can see that it's domed here so we get a little bit more compression. We'll explain that later on in the build. And then we can also see that if we flip it over to the cap side, this surface here has been machined. So you can see that the caps are pre-installed and torqued down, and they do that because this engine has been balanced. They run a hone through here to take off some material to make sure that it's perfectly circular, and that's really good on a street build like we're doing here. And we can tell that this engine has been balanced because here on number 4, this has not been ground off at all, and on number 1, it's a nice machine surface. So this engine has been balanced. This piston and connecting rod would happen to be a little bit heavier than this one over here. And you don't have to do that on a stock engine if everything is right from the manufacturer, right from GM, but this is a street build, so you kind of have to do that. So we're gonna show you how to go with just one piston all the way through. These next steps apply to all 8 pistons, but we're only gonna show you on one because it's identical, and filming 8 pistons is a little redundant. So we're gonna show you how to do that. First we need to clean it, and just like we've done the rest of the engine, and then we can install our piston rings. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so the next thing we need to talk about is piston orientation and which side of the engine it goes on, because when we're putting the piston rings on, which we're gonna do in a minute, you need to know which way it's gonna face the engine. Engine orientation and piston orientation to it is insanely important. So I have number 1 here, and we can tell because there's a nice Sharpie right there. And the way you can tell where the front is to the engine in relation to a piston is what side these little tangs in there, right there at the end of my fingertip. You see those? Oh yeah, you see those. See those right there? Those right there need to face outward from the block, right? So this is the number 1, and I'm holding it as if the engine is facing this way. So it's gonna sit down on the crankshaft like this, and the piston's gonna be like this in the bore, right? So we know that the piston is facing the correct way if I'm behind the engine and you guys in front of it. So what we're gonna do is grab a Sharpie and put a little arrow pointing forward so we can't get confused. And on this engine, this particular big block, a really easy way to look at it is the odd number of pistons are gonna be on the right side if you're looking straight at it, and the evens are gonna be on the left. So keep that in mind when we're putting rings on. Okay, so what you're looking at here is quite the roadblock for us. This is the bottom end of the connecting rod for piston number 3. And we noticed that on the bottom of the upper tang here, you see this little, it's actually technically on the top of the lower tang. On the top of the main cap here, you can see this big rectangle at the end of my pointer. That's not supposed to be there. Something went wrong somewhere in the machining process or maybe the manufacturing process. I don't know, but it should look like this over here. See, there's no rectangle and it's nice and clean and perfect, and it's just the tang. This has this tang plus this little weird rectangle. So unfortunately, all our pistons have to go back to the machine shop and be remachined or get new connecting rods or something. I'm gonna talk to the machine guy about that and whatever his recommendations are, probably some new connecting rods. So it's not all sunshine and puppies for us. This is a major setback and something we're going to have to deal with. So if your connecting rods came back with these in there, go ahead and just send it right back, because if you put a bearing in there, it is likely to spin and ruin your entire engine. This is what it should look like on a healthy connecting rod. See how there's no rectangle anywhere? It's just the tangs. This is what you're really looking for on all of your connecting rods. All right, it's a couple weeks later. We got our pistons back from the machine shop again. Even I run into roadblocks. I'm human, things happen. We can see that the metals now match. Before they were kind of coppery and off looking. I wasn't really sure what was going on. My engine machinist said it was totally fine, but this is my engine. I want to build it this way. Engine building's an art, and it's what you make of it. And I want to make this as best as I can. And we can see that these are in phenomenal shape. I already have them numbered. They're even numbered on the side here from GM, the castings. But I went ahead and put some Sharpie numbers on there so I can tell what they are at a glance. All right, so what we're gonna do, since the pistons have been out of our sight for a little bit, we don't know if they're dirty again. So we need to clean them using some carburetor spray and compressed air. So now that our piston is nice and clean, we're gonna go ahead and take the rod apart. So I have my piston here mounted in my vise sideways, and I have it just holding on to the actual rod itself, but the piston is free to move. If this is like really tough to move, you're tightening the vise against the piston, that's not good. You wanna stay away from this upper area as well, so you really just want the vise to grab the rod itself on the edge there, and not too terribly tight. Don't Hulk crush it. All right, so what we need to do is remove the main cap here using a 9/16 socket. And we're just gonna go ahead and do that. And we're gonna loosen. These are torqued down, so they might be on a little tighter than you might think from the machine shop. But once you break them loose, they come off nice and easy. There's 1 and 2. We're gonna set these aside so we don't lose them. We're gonna take a plastic hammer and just tap the sides of it here. All right, so I've readjusted my piston here. The piston still moves nice and easy. So I'm just grabbing the side of the rod here. And this cap is on really, really tight. And so we're gonna have to hit these little kickouts here, little tangs hanging off. We're gonna use a brass hammer for that. See, it's already broken loose right there, and we can turn the piston around and do the other side. And there we go. So the reason the cap is on so tight, and it's kind of hard to get it off, is these knurls here are actually what center the cap on there. So you're fighting those resistances. So if you're wondering why it's so tight, these would be your answer. All right, so we're gonna go over our piston rings real quick. I have these performance racing rings from Engine Pro Racing, and their part number is 43M5528030. I have left a link down below in the description to these exact rings. All right, before we go any further, do not remove your piston rings until you are ready to install, because it shows right here where they go. Top groove, second groove, and third groove. So you don't want to mix those up. So the next thing I want to go over is how our piston is mounted in the vise here, and putting a towel in between the jaws is really important so you don't mar your connecting rod. And it's basically holding the connecting rod, and you want to make sure that you have a little bit of play on the piston. Like I said earlier, as you can see, this moves pretty freely fore and aft and left to right. But you don't want too much play, because then you're just going to be chasing it when you're trying to put the rings on. So what you're looking at here is our cylinder bore for number 1, and what I've done is taken one of the piston rings before I've installed it on the piston, because I want to check end gap clearance here, and according to the paperwork it should be at least no smaller than 16 thousandths of an inch, and I have a 16 thousandths of an inch feeler gauge here, and we're going to see if that fits. And we can see it's pretty snug, but it's kind of loose. It's actually decently loose, so it's probably maybe 17 thousandths, which is fine. You know, it's a little bit bigger than expected. They're usually pretty good from the factory, and you can check all the piston rings if you want to, or none, and trust the factory. But it is a good idea to go ahead and check them, because if they are too small, if this clearance is too small and the piston grows under heat, this will push together and gall the side of your cylinder and ruin your engine. So if you find that one of these is too small, you can go ahead and buy a ring filer. They're available on Amazon, and they usually have like a diamond cutting wheel. Just don't cut too terribly much off. So I've got our paperwork here from our piston ring manufacturer, and they're saying that orientation on the piston is important, which it is. You want to make sure that it is installed correctly. Now the piston ring is either going to have a top written on it or a dot, and both of those indicate that that needs to face up towards the top of the piston. And we can go ahead and remove a piston ring here out of the packaging so I can show you. And so on this side, they're usually They're going to be on either side of the end gap here. There's no dot or top on here, and you can just barely see right there at the end of my fingertip, yes, that there is in fact a dot. So it goes in the piston like this. I also want to explain that the top thing we just explained only applies to the top 2 rings. The third one can go in either way. So I'm going to go ahead and take the piston rings out of the box, and I'm going to arrange them in left to right, just so at a quick glance I know that this is top, this is middle, and this is bottom. Stickers! Most important part of piston rings, the sticker! Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and take our oil control rings here out. And this is how they come. So this is what they look like, that's how they come. And then these 2 are just compression rings. I've showed you these ones previously. This is our top rings here. And they look very similar, so it's easy to get them confused, so we're going to leave them in their own packaging. The first thing we're going to do is an oil control ring, and it's a little different from the other ones because the end gap here actually closes on its own, and it's pretty easy. You can just use your fingers, you don't really need a tool or anything. And we can put that on, and the end gap, the opening, needs to be at about the 3 o'clock position like on the diagram on screen. You need one of these for the bottom of the oil control ring and one for the top. And it looks like the end gap for this is, according to our diagram, goes about the 10:30 position. And we're going to put one side in, make sure it's on the bottom. Alright, we can start with the corner where it needs to be at that 10:30 position. And then we can just roll the ring around it. It should go into its home. Alright, so we got that bottom oil control ring on there. Now we need to get the top one. It kind of makes a sandwich. And that opening is at about the, I don't know, 7 o'clock position. It's on the diagram. And we can do the same thing, but for the upper. And there we go. And you don't want to spin these rings once they're installed. They can float on top of the piston. They're supposed to be loose, but as soon as they're installed, you don't want to be moving them around too much. All right, and we're going to work on our second ring here. That's the one that goes on next. We'll just wipe it down real quick, make sure there's no manufacturing powder or anything on that. And we want to make sure that the dot is facing up, and we can see that it is right there. It's a little tricky to see. You can see it a little bit easier in person. You can check the back, make sure there's no dot, and there's not, so it needs to go in like this. And it's at the 9 o'clock position, so basically it needs to face the left, where we are. And we're going to use our piston ring pliers here. And that's what this tool is. And we can put that in between the end gap, because you can't bend your ring like this. You can't twist it. It needs to just be opened gently, and you don't want to open it too much, so you can set your adjustment here to make sure you don't go too crazy when you're trying to get this thing on.
Pull it up. There you go.
So this needs to be moving a little bit. So if this is like really tight and it's not going anywhere, that means the ring is too thick and you need new ones. And the end gap is at our 9 o'clock position perfectly. So now we can grab it from our red container, our top ring, and we can go around and make sure that doesn't have any kind of manufacturing dust or anything like that, and look for our dot. This one's a little confusing because there's a little dark spot right there. That is not the dot. It is a more pronounced dot. Looks like that. So that is on the top, and it goes at our 3 o'clock position, so like this. But I'm going to put it in like this because I'm on the left side of the piston. So once it's in, I'm just going to turn it around because they turn fairly easily. So we're going to do that. Make it a little easier on us for install. There we go. The top one's easy. And then we can rotate this top one to our 3 o'clock position. And I like to push it out like this on both sides, just for my reference, so I can see that they oppose each other, the openings. So we can see that the end gaps oppose each other, one at 9 o'clock and one at 3 o'clock. And that's what it should look like. So we need to pre-lube the bore, and I have some engine oil on my hand here, and we're just going to go around inside the cylinder bore here and make sure it's not on the head connecting surface like that. We need to wipe that up. And then we can move on to lubricating the piston. Next thing we want to do over at catch basin is lubricate our wrist pin and oil rings here, and you can be pretty generous at this point. More oil isn't going to hurt it. If anything, it's going to help it. And you just want to make sure it gets nice in the wrist pin and on the piston rings just like that. Alright, so what we're going to do now is put the piston in, but before I do, I'm going to put my hand underneath the bore where the piston's going to go to make sure it's not going to hit anything like the crankshaft. Like that, and we want to make sure our arrow is pointing to the front of the engine. So what we're looking at now is the bottom of the bore where we just put number 1, and we just want to make sure that this isn't going to gall any of the bore surface or where the connecting rod actually goes onto the crankshaft. So we want to make sure that's nice and free like this and it hasn't galled anything. So what you're looking at again is this counterbalance weight on the crankshaft, and you want to make sure that this surface, the piston, is actually parallel with this surface, because if the piston is turned at all, it can gall this surface and run into a lot of problems. So this is a piston ring compressor. They come in many different shapes and sizes. You can rent them at AutoZone for free or very little money, and the only thing you really need to know about them is they're tapered kind of like a cone down toward the bottom, and you can even see on my tool it says bottom just right there. A little tricky to see, but it will say bottom somewhere on it pointing down, and bottom means it goes on like this. So we're gonna go ahead and use that. All right, so I'm gonna take some motor oil we got on the top of the block here, and I'm just gonna line the inside of our piston ring compressor. It doesn't take a ton of oil, but it should be lubricated. Just like that. So you want it up a little bit, that way when you're cramming the piston down, the taper helps you put the piston rings in place. So we're gonna put some pressure, we're gonna keep pressure on the piston ring compressor, and you wanna get a rubber mallet or a plastic hammer and hammer around this to make sure that the piston ring compressor is flush with the top of the block here. And once we're sure of that, we're gonna maintain pressure. We're gonna have a helper down below holding the bottom end to make sure it doesn't gall anything on its way down. And then we can grab the handle side of our hammer and drive it home. And it's reasonably hard. There we go. Okay, so we're on the bottom side now, and this gives us access to bring the rod towards us so we can clean it off before we install our bearing. We're gonna use some carburetor spray on a paper towel. We're going to clean that bearing surface. Want to make sure that's as clean as you can get it. Just like that, and now we can put our bearing in. Alright, so here are our connecting rod bearings, and they're a King bearing, a CR808 SI010. I have left a link down below in the description to these exact bearings, because our crankshaft has been ground 10 under. That's what the 10 stands for. So you get these, and there we go. There's one of our bearings, and there's no difference between the top and bottom. They're identical. So we can take this over to our connecting rod. All right, you want to make sure these surfaces are nice and clean before you install our bearing here. And the tang is actually facing me. My finger's kind of covering it, but there's a tang here and it's facing me. So the tang on my bearing also needs to face me. And it's easier to put the tang side in first and making that a little bit lower, because as you put in the far side, it's going to pop up a little bit. And there we go. Top of the bearing is installed. So that's what the top of the bearing looks like once it is nice and installed. So now that our bearing is nice and installed, we can go ahead and send it home onto our crank here. And it's helpful to have a helper at this point, kind of guide it for you while you're ramrodding the top of the piston with a hammer. So we're gonna use a little bit of oil I have on my fingertips here. We're gonna apply that to the crankshaft lobe here. And you don't want to put it on the bearing side because you don't want oil to get underneath the bearing. So at this point, I'm going to put these on. They're like a little rubber protector, and you can go on the threads, which will prevent it from galling even if you make a mistake and it kind of nicks the side of the crank. Because this would be a really bad time for you to make a really easy mistake, and this will prevent that. So that's kind of nice. These are just little rubber ends. You can get them at any hardware store, any auto parts store. They're very common. They even make special ones just for this application, but you don't need those. These come in packs of 100. So I'm having my helper assist me in guiding the rod into its home while I am using the handle of a hammer to hammer it home. And there we go. That is ready for the cap. And we can at this point take off our rubber protectors. There we go. This is a good point to look in there and make sure that the bearing surface is parallel with the connecting rod surface, because if that's off in any way and isn't square, you're gonna have problems. But ours looks perfect. Yours should look like this. All right, so what we're gonna do now is grab a paper towel again with some carburetor spray on it. And then we're gonna clean that bearing mating surface just like we did on the rod side. Yeah, see, look how icky that was. It's awful. Can't have that in my engine. It's a clean engine. Oh yeah, that is just pristine. Very cool. So we can grab another bearing, and the bearings are pretty darn clean from factory, so they don't need another cleaning. And we're gonna install that, again, putting the tank side down and having it sunk a little bit in, maybe like a 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch. And then pushing it down on the other side. So you want to look for this surface here to be parallel, because if this is parallel up here, you know the bearing's in correctly, and you want to make sure it's not crooked or anything, but the tang usually takes care of that. So this looks perfect and is ready for the engine. Okay, so we're going to install our main cap here, and you want to make sure the tang side is on the tang side with the rod, because if you put it on backward, it's not going to work. You're going to actually ruin it. So tang side facing me, tang side facing me. I know that goes on correctly like that. We can put it on and then install our nuts. Before you start pounding your keyboard, I will get a torque spec in just a moment. I'm just going to snug these up a little bit evenly. Just going to snug them up and do them as evenly as you can. And once they're nice and snug, we can go ahead and grab our torque wrench and get a torque spec. All right, so I got my torque spec. It's 50 foot-pounds, but before you go running off with your torque wrench, with Glee, you need to do it in 3 stages. So we're going to go 20 foot-pounds and like 35 foot-pounds, and then our final tightening will be 50 foot-pounds. There we go. There's our 20, so now we're going to go to 35. And you want to do these as evenly as possible. Might take you a little bit, but that's okay. There's no punishment in taking a longer time to do something if it's done right. There's 35. And now we can go up to 50. Place. I'm okay doing them at a quarter turn at a time, honestly. There's 50 on the left, and 50 on the right. And this piston is officially installed. Now just do that 7 more times, and you're good to go. When you're working on your particular piston, you'll note that our crankshaft is as far away as possible it can be from the piston, and that's so you have plenty of area to work in, because if you do it the other way with the crank jammed up to where the piston usually comes down at, you're not gonna have enough room to maneuver the bearing and stuff. So it's important to have whatever piston you're working on, have it as far away from the piston as possible. So what you're looking at here is the flange where the flex plate or flywheel attaches to the back of the crankshaft, and I have some of those special bolts in there. And what you can do to rotate the engine, since there's no bolt on the front of it, is put these bolts in here, and then you can use a big pry bar or large screwdriver to rotate your engine into the exact position you need to work on it. So this is what your piston should look like after it's been installed in your engine, and you just need this 7 more times and you're all good to go. So that's how to put pistons in a Gen 4 big block Chevy. There's really not a lot to it. It's just a lot of monotony, a lot of again and again, because you're doing everything 8 times, but it's very approachable, it's very doable, and it's a lot of fun. Thank you so much for watching. All applicable links are located down below in the description. Make sure you're subscribed. More big block videos coming very soon, and I'll catch you next time.